Good afternoon. My name is Johann. I come from Brandeis University, and my colleague Brandon White comes to you from the University of California, Berkeley. And we're here to give you a presentation on a method and a tool that we have been developing for about 2 years now, called the point of originality, where essentially the one-sentence elevator pitch is that it's a tool that's used for automated evaluation of student progress by analyzing the students' written assignments. This is sort of how the talk will go. I will start by kind of trying to frame the problem that we think we're dealing with. Give you a little bit of theoretical background for the tool itself and a brief introduction to how it works. I'm going to leave it to Brandon there to go a little bit of in-depth in how our evaluation method works that explores the students' written assignments. He's going to present some case study results, and then we'll conclude in the end with a summary and some discussion about future work. So, if we think about how we do teaching and learning, and take any example, English 101, we kind of have two stakeholders. We have the students, and the students are there to learn. That's their primary responsibility, or one of them. And they do so, for example, by interacting with their peers. They establish their own identity, they have a voice, they develop their own understanding within the context of each other's understanding. At the same time, we have an additional stakeholder, which is the teacher, who is there to teach. They're there to monitor primarily, facilitate the students, help organize the students, help the students explain key concepts, and so on. Now, we see, when we think about that picture and those two stakeholders, we see a potential problem here. And the question marks are there for a reason. The potential bad thing that's happening is this trend in the American education system, at least, where we're migrating towards larger lecture courses. And we see this particularly happening in the gateway courses, like Psych 101 or English 101. And it's problematic because, as we've seen through the research, these are environments that are less useful for fostering higher order thinking. They turn into these venues where the students are sort of mere participants, where they get fire hosed with information from the stage, if you will. But not to sound too negative, at the same time, we see a lot of good things happening that are a particular advantage to us for our project, because technology plays a more crucial role here. Because it's, on one hand, as we've seen through the research, it's creating kind of new opportunities for us to do teaching and learning. Not otherwise necessarily possible if we didn't have the technology. But at the same time, it perhaps allows us to some degree, create some of those elements that we like about the face-to-face teaching. So take English 101 now, that is happening online, with 150 students in a given university, and we're making the students do blogging. They're blogging twice a week throughout the duration of the semester. So by moving things online and using technology, we might be sort of been able to hold on and bring with us some of those good things about the face-to-face teaching. But that sort of addresses the need of the one particular stakeholder, which is the students, and trying to create an environment that's conducive to learning. If we think back to my example before about the teachers and their main responsibility is to monitor, then if we move the learning online, what is the thing that the teacher will actually see? And it's not a glitch in the slides. This is what we like to refer to sort of as the black box problem of educational technology. We, on one hand, have met the students, so continue to sort of think the back of your heads about the example that I used about the 150 students in a class that are blogging twice a week. We've met the students before they started the exercise. We know the prerequisites they took. We kind of get a feeling for where they stand and who they are and so on. And then we sort of have them start this online learning activity, and they enter into this this black box. And then without the appropriate tools, we don't really see them until the end, or put it differently, at the end, we see the product that they have created as a result of engaging in this exercise. And I think many of you will agree with me that it's not necessarily exclusively the product that is the most valuable, it's the process that created the product and those little sub-products that got created along the way that are most important. But because we've moved it online, you've sort of taken the learning to this time and space that's a little bit intangible for the instructor. And in our case, if we exclusively just like put it online without having to sort of peek inside the black box, we would sort of have this over-reliance, in our case, on iterative online writing without really a sense of how it positively and or negatively affects the learning process. But in addition to that, for the teacher, it's the volume. If we have this trend towards these larger lecture courses, we have, let's say, 150 students, which is a relatively low number for many universities. We have 150 students who are blogging twice a week throughout the 15-week semester. That's 300 blog posts that get created every week in a single course. And I'm not even talking about the wonderful opportunities they have to interact with one another through the commenting system. The materials are just accumulating at an alarming rate, making any kind of continuous monitoring sort of daunting, if not impossible to do. Which sort of brings us to this project that we call the point of originality, where in short, it's about doing an automated evaluation to try and figure out if the students are mastering the course materials that they're reading about. And this is sort of the point in the presentation where we make a disclaimer where it's not an automated grading tool. If you were to use it for automated grading, then we would have to have a little bit of a chat. What we're essentially looking at is the student's style of writing, or in other words, recasting. And Brandon will actually go into a little bit of more detail about what recasting means and what it is specifically that we're looking for. But we're essentially looking for that point in time when a student graduates from mere paraphrasing of the material and being sort of more original. In other words, it's not the materials that they're writing about, it's original, because they're writing about the same course material that's been taught all the time. And it's not that the way in which necessarily that the writing is original, but the reaching original expression. The primary audience and the goal for our application is sort of twofold. On one, we're trying to build a piece of technology for the students. In other words, it's used by the instructor, but we're trying to enable the instructor in this intangible time and space with all this material to do timely interventions, figure out when a student is not understanding key course topics and intervene in a timely manner so you can bring them back up to speed. But in parallel, we also want to do this for the instructors, because if we think about us trying to visualize when students reach their point of originality in the course as a timeline that goes from left to right, if more or less the entire class is flatlining, it's not necessarily because the students are lazy, or not necessarily because they don't want to learn. Maybe there's an adjustment needed in your pedagogical strategy, so the tool becomes a device that the instructor can use, him or herself, to monitor their own teaching abilities and adjust when needed. The system is more or less a web-based application that visualizes the students' writing samples from left to right in chronological order. And the system takes in two inputs. First of all, it's the students' writing examples, which can be blog posts, for example, which is what we're using here today to show you, which we get sort of automatically in from whatever system we're using. And then it's the manual entering of key query terms, which are, in other words, the topics or the subtopics that the instructor wants to be focusing on at any given point in time in the semester, and see how that is working out in terms of comprehension in the class. And with that, I'll give it over to Brandon, who is going to explain to you in a little bit more detail how the method works and talk about some results.
Thanks so much for that, Johann. I'm Brandon White, and I'm going to be picking up where Johann left off to walk you through what we mean by the point of originality, to give you some sense of how the system works, and from there to discuss some of our preliminary findings. So let's say that I'm an instructor running one of those courses that Johann was just telling us about, be it a large or a small class. As I'm building my syllabus and scheduling the readings and things like that, certain core concepts that I want my students to focus on should become overwhelmingly apparent. Let's also say that I'm asking students to do what's so common today, to prepare iterative responses to the material on a week-to-week basis, be it as blogs or as discussion board posts or what have you. In this case, I want to be sure that some of those core concepts are what the students are actually reflecting on in their iterative assignments. So as an instructor, knowing that students are engaging in higher order thinking about certain aspects of the course allows me to self-monitor. Because if students are responding to the readings but aren't ever mentioning the terms or concepts that I understand to be most important, as Johann said, either there's something defective in the student's understanding or in my teaching. But in either case, I want to be able to spot the problem and, hopefully, to do something about it before it's too late. Now, I could conceivably just take all of these posts or what have you and throw them into Firefox or Chrome and just Control F and try to hunt for every instance of a student using that topic, but students might not always be using the same terms within their writing that I would be, and that's not actually a bad thing. We'd ideally like to see students developing novel approaches to the subject matter. Studies show that student writing that is genuinely exceptional is that which demonstrates mastery in new, profound, or statistically significant ways. If I really want to understand how students are relating to core concepts within the course, then, I want to be able to take into account all possible versions of how those concepts might be expressed. Beyond that, I want to be able to ascertain whether students are simply paraphrasing me or graduating to more and more sophisticated levels of reasoning. This is based on the pedagogical principle of recasting. Students demonstrate their mastery of course materials by finding ways of thinking through those materials and putting those materials into their own words. Now, in order to determine whether students are using words that align with any particular lecture topic, we need to have a way of expressing how all words, at least in English, relate to one another. Our way of approaching this is by using a lexical database called Wordnet. Wordnet arranges nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs by their conceptual semantic relationship. This essentially just makes Wordnet into a hierarchical thesaurus. So rather than saying, say, that dogs and canines are synonyms for one another, it might tell you that all Dalmatians are dogs are domestic animals are animals, and so on and so forth. This arrangement is called a synset tree. This is a rudimentary example, but we can think of other ones. So a form of government would be a democracy, which is parallel but antithetical to despotism, which would be synonymous for tyranny, and so on and so forth through more and more complex evolutions. To return to my original problem, just using what I have here, assuming I was an instructor in an admittedly terribly remedial zoology course, if one of the core course concepts that I'm interested in was simply the word animal, it would be useful to know that my students were writing not only about that literal term, but also about cats and dogs and Dalmatians and everything else that couldn't actually find its way onto the chart. This, too, is an example of recasting. If I want students to know one thing, in this case animals, that they can deploy concrete examples of animals would be the readiest evidence that they could actually understand. Or if I wanted to know that they were talking about Dalmatians, I would want to know that they recognized that Dalmatians were in fact animals in the other direction. So the same would be true in my government example as well. This chart displays all of the lexical entailments that would be possible for nouns within Wordnet. The tree that we're looking at on your left displays a subset of words by their hyponym-hypernym relation. Now, if I'd wanted to know if my students were writing about animals, and they happen to be discussing Dalmatians, I'd obviously need some way of figuring out how closely related those two terms might be. If we looked at the tree, one way of doing this would be to simply count the number of jumps it would take to deliver us from one word to another. So dog would be 2 spaces removed from cat by way of domestic animal as the mediating tier. However, there's a problem with this method, in that not all relationships between words have or should have the same weight. The relationship between finger and hand is a very different one from dog and domestic animal. Whereas all dogs are domestic animals, fingers are only parts of hands. If we just modified the tree slightly to include what on there is a meronym relationship, we'd want an entirely different method of judging what the distance was between those terms. The system is only useful to us insofar as it corresponds with active intuition. Following a system sketched by another set of researchers, we've installed a series of weights that account for various types of lexical relationships. The distance calculation between a core concept and its use by a student is defined by these particular weights, multiplied by an additional weight, depending on how many jumps between levels it takes to get from one to the other. This method of counting has been found to have a 94% correspondence with human intuition. So if you were to ask someone how much monks have in common with magicians, there likely wouldn't be that much of a match, except that they both conceivably wear robes, whereas monks and monasteries do have a good deal in common with one another, just not in a way that's so easy to correlate. What the point of originality system does is that it asks an instructor to input a key course concept. The system then generates a synset tree, like this one here, for every query term, and then does the same for every word within a given student's writing sample. Where there's any kind of a match within a specific number of degrees of freedom, the synset tree thus turns into a synset web, and the distance from where we start at the top with our query term to the bottom in the student's writing is found using something like that algorithm. For any individual writing sample, these matches are then added together to produce a composite originality value. Put most basically, the method of scoring helps us isolate within reason when students were deploying recast iterations of the original concept. So we're going to be looking now at a specific subset of actual data from a class taught at Brandeis back in 2008. And I'm actually going to have to jump out of the slide to go to the internet for that. But the course that we're looking at was a course on Internet and Society, which was an entry-level computer science course at Brandeis. During the semester, students were responsible for producing blog posts on any of the course topics or any of the topics that the lectures or the readings had covered. 9 weeks in, students were then asked to prepare a summative essay assignment on a specific topic from amongst those. So let's see how this works. That wasn't so bad. So the essay prompt that we have here asks students to specifically explain the concept of the Innovate Commons and to relate this concept to other concepts, the things in red, that the course had covered. Although several students had opted to blog on some of these topics, none at the time could have been aware that they would ultimately be assessed on these ones in particular. It was during this 9-week interval that students had the opportunity to cultivate mastery of a particular topic before they actually had to put that knowledge into practice through a more traditional summative exercise. Thus, that window, the 9 weeks, constitutes what we generally refer to as the lead-in period for this particular set of course materials. So let's pretend for a moment that I'm the instructor for Internet and Society. My students have been blogging for some weeks now. I've drafted my essay assignment, but I really don't know whether my students are prepared for what I'm about to hand them. Presumably, some are more prepared than others, but ideally I'd like to know which students belong to which group, so that if certain students seem to be going too far off track, I can possibly do something about it, which is where the point of originality tool comes in. This is the point of originality interface, which here I've pre-loaded with the writing activity for a student enrolled in Internet and Society named Dana. We can see that the query terms that I've entered are up here at the right, which are the same core concepts that have been highlighted in the essay assignment a moment ago. The timeline visualizes all of the matches between Dana's vocabulary and my original query terms in chronological order from left to right. The larger the size of the circle and the warmer or redder its color, the higher her conceptual investment in my original query terms. Since this is legacy data, this red dot here actually represents Dana's summative essay assignment. Although we do have controls in place to minimize repeated mentions of the same terms over and over, since Dana was specifically asked in the assignment to address the concepts of the Innovate Commons and whatnot directly, it would stand to reason that we would have a high concentration of recast terminology for those concepts here. It's everything prior to this point here that we're interested in, and which constitutes Dana's lead-in period. But what we'll detect is the relative dearth of matches between my core concepts and Dana's writing at any of the points prior to writing her essay. It's not that Dana wasn't doing the work, it's simply that her attentions over the period were apparently directed to other parts of the material, but material that was actually going to prove less relevant to what Dana would ultimately be expected to know. Now to quickly look at another student, this is a different student, Claire, who has a timeline that looks almost completely different. The largest circle is actually this one, but Claire's essay assignment is actually here. So all of this constitutes Claire's specific lead-in period. Put differently, Claire's lead-in period actually consists of terminology that was more original in its approach to the query topics than even her eventual essay assignment would prove. It should come as no surprise, or hopefully it won't, that Claire was one of the best performing students in the class and that Dana, who we saw earlier, was one of the lowest. So what was Claire doing correctly? At one point, this one here, Claire had engaged with these query terms even more extensively than she had during the composition of her essay. So to give you a peek behind the curtain, we can go back to this. So this is an excerpt from that particular post, which I've blown up for you. Each of the italicized terms, group, people, community, volunteer, support, is a query term match for the original essay query term, commons. For the purposes of the point of originality tool, each of these individual terms would count towards Claire's demonstration of mastery in that particular side of the material. An instructor reading over this sentence would likely come to something of the same conclusion. The purpose of open licensing is indeed to stress the communal nature of the endeavor. Although the term commons itself appears nowhere within Claire's post, her detailed discussion of the consequences of Mozilla's EULA makes it evident that she understands the stakes involved. It's engagements like this one that we posited and have since demonstrated are the most likely to lead to success. What we found is that there's a direct relationship between what we've defined as the originality variance, which is the difference between the originality of a student's summative paper assignment and their iterative blogging activity during the lead-in period. What we were interested in was essentially the difference between Claire's case and Dana's case. When Dana sat down to write her essay, it was clear from her activity that she was only just beginning to engage with the key concepts for the first time. What we found was that this activity in the lead-in period was a strongly correlating factor for how much students could be expected to achieve. Originality variance was an important metric for us as researchers because during the lead-in period, we had access to data that provided the most insight into what the window would look like for an instructor actually using this tool live in process. These are the findings that you'll actually see this chart in the conference proceedings, but I can actually update those figures somewhat. Around the time that we were finalizing the paper, we tried to implement an additional component of the algorithm called the decay factor, which ensures that repetitions of the same term over and over again, beyond a certain threshold, aren't always awarded the same weight. When we implemented this change, we found to our relief that our results not only didn't get any worse, they actually got better. This measure of originality variance became sharper, but I can now also say that there are two patterns of original engagement that are predictive of student success. Those students with the highest average originality over the lead-in period are, simply put, the ones most likely to succeed, but so too are those students who have only brief bursts of highly original activity. Claire, who you'll hopefully remember, is actually a good test case for both of these patterns. Extremely high burst of original engagement, as we see in the middle of the timeline and what we were just looking at, strongly correlates with student success, as does a more measured, consistent engagement, as we could see sort of towards the tail end of Claire's timeline. Having both of these options is important because let's remember the structure of the exercise we're dealing with. Blogging at regular intervals was fairly chaotic. During the lead-in period, students might engage with one side of the material more consistently from week to week, or they might delve into every topic in depth just once. Knowing that both approaches to the material are reasonably predictive of success gives an instructor the flexibility to understand the potential of either approach. But what about Dana? Let's remember that 9 weeks separated this earliest point from this one. As early as here, or earlier here, or here, an instructor using the point of originality tool would have been informed that danger was in danger of failing the essay assignment. Each perpetuation of the trend every week that goes by is in some respects an opportunity missed. What would be the ideal use case for the predictive potential of the point of originality would be that it would provide an opportunity for pedagogical monitoring. Claire's achievement and Dana's struggles came in relation to a specific subset of query terms. It's not inconceivable, however, that an instructor might encounter a class made up entirely of Claire's or made up entirely of Dana's. The latter case would likely be cause for some concern. As I'd said earlier, if students aren't reflecting on the concepts at hand, or at least not reflecting on the concepts that are, for the purposes of the syllabus and for the purposes of grading, the most important, then either something wrong with their comprehension or something has gone astray in my teaching. It's this point that I would probably want to, that I would want to intervene. perhaps meeting with individual students to discuss how they were dealing with the course material, or rearranging the syllabus to revisit some of the concepts that the whole class appeared to be missing. The predictive capacity of the tool is such that we can determine roughly whether students are getting certain concepts. What I would suggest in closing is perhaps that its fullest potential is that it forces instructors to think more critically about how vital each of those concepts actually are. Navigating just how these various pedagogical adjustments play out in real time is one of the things that we're committed to in our future work. I've thus far been discussing the point of originality as a way of approaching iterative exercises for students, be it blogging or discussion forums or what have you. But really, it's also a tool that offers an opportunity for iterative refinement of pedagogical technique. Part of the reason that iterative exercises, co-blogging, Blackboard, and what have you, exist is that class time, whether that class is large or small, is a limited resource. Our hope is that systematic use of tools like the point of originality, or perhaps like learning analytics more generally, can make it so that that limited resource is better spent. Activities like co-blogging are nominally supposed to make students better, but using predictive modeling to interrogate how that learning is taking place gives us an opportunity to make teaching better as well. So with that, I guess I'll invite Johann back on stage. Thank you so much for your time. And I guess I'm supposed to ask if there are any questions.
The blog as a genre is, in the wild, fundamentally a generally collaborative tool, right? It's something that facilitates a dialogue between an author and an audience. And what I didn't see in this analysis was any attention to that specific social, dialogical nature of the blogging text. So it feels like, I wonder, how, in this course, how is this blogging assignment framed? You speak of it as an exercise, right? I could see, so it concerns me as a writing teacher that this becomes just drudgery, like doing a problem set. I mean, is this really an authentic writing task, or is it simply a rehearsal exercise?
So I think Johann might actually want to speak more to like the nuances of blogging, but I do know that coming from an English department, we very frequently sort of give students iterative exercises that are reflections on whatever we happen to be reading, one particular week, and then eventually we sort of ask them to sort of collapse back. So why we were using blogging here was that it was kind of representative of sort of a span of that type of activity. But one of the things that actually didn't get to make it into the presentation was that we did run a separate set of tests that you could actually find in the proceedings. But one of the things that we found is that the students who had the highest originality as given by our system during the lead-in period were also those students who were taking the fullest advantage of the collaborative nature of the activity. So we could actually match up sort of the results that our system was producing, but then sort of pair that with how frequently students were commenting, how frequently they were viewing certain materials, and that sort of thing. So whereas there's an opportunity to kind of relate the content analysis to the interactivity aspect, it was just kind of a lot to compress into one window. So does that hopefully answer that side of your question?
Did you guys run into any sort of sharp limitations of the Wordnet database in terms of, specialized terms or things that concepts that you want to convey but that were not, appropriately mapped?
So where Wordnet does run into trouble, and like we were using a course that was designed to be interdisciplinary, so it was a computer science course, but that was also open to people who are non-majors, non-specialists. Where Wordnet does occasionally run into difficulty is dealing with specialized scientific terminology, with medical terminology, but at least when we started this project, I think Wordnet was on 2.0. And sort of midway along the line, they graduated to Wordnet 3.0. The way that Wordnet works is that it's maintained by the linguistics department at Princeton. So they have people whose basic responsibility is to try to grow out those synset trees and to develop them more broadly.
So if somebody were to have a class, they could like just, there is a mechanism to add all their relevant stuff to Wordnet with relationships.
Yeah, so there's conceivably that possibility. But then one of the other things that we've sort of noticed is, I mean, this is a bad example because this is actually in Wordnet, but we were looking at a psychology class recently. So like something like the hippocampus might not actually have that many associations within sort of the tiers. But what we've sort of found is that when students are talking about the hippocampus, they're talking about what it does, they're talking about memory, they're talking about things that are functionally related, so that the concepts kind of wind up clustering in a way that still makes the tool usable and valuable. Yeah.
Last question?
Yes, I was wondering if you were ever considering having them draw concept maps instead of writing something, because then you have maybe a more direct measure of like their internalized conceptual structures.
That's an interesting suggestion, and we haven't thought of that ability of having the students do that. Simply because where the work comes from is people were getting sort of bombarded with too many writing samples, and the immediate obvious solution to us was to start to see how we could explore the textual content. But it's definitely an interesting suggestion.